welcome to the latest edition of Trans Stupid. We'll take a look at the wonderful world of LGBTQIA+++ news, because stupidity is intersectional. Now, with the wonderful world that we're currently living in when we're all in lockdown, you would think that there would be absolutely no LGBT news out there because everyone's so focused on coronavirus. And whilst one of my stories this week does involve COVID-19, there is still things to talk about, and the first story of this week involves this man. Now, you probably should recognise him. That, of course, is Boy George, probably one of the biggest queer icons out there. Now, Boy George has become infamous over the last couple of months for apparently being transphobic by not really respecting people's pronouns and kind of thinking that this multi-gendered world that we now live in is a little bit ridiculous. And of course, he's set off the likes of Pink News once again. Trans people are being murdered every week, but disgraced singer Boy George still thinks people want to be offended over gender issues. The convicted criminal George O'Dowd, more popularly known as Boy George, has said that people want to be offended over trans issues. George, who maintains some popularity in the post-#MeToo era a full decade after he was jailed for falsely imprisoning a male escort, spoke about his views on trans issues after facing a backlash in January for declaring pronouns a modern form of attention-seeking. In an interview with the Sunday Times, Culture magazine, the former Culture Club singer said, "I even feel uncomfortable trying to explain what I meant. When I was growing up, nobody used the term transgender because it was almost like a medical term, so this transgender thing is new, and for our generation, it's just getting our heads around it. But people want to be offended because they think that whatever's going on for them is much more important than anything else. But I'll call you whatever you want. I spent years calling people fake names, Boy George, Susie Sue, Johnny Rotten. Of course, it's not the same as your sexuality." He added, "Let's not forget that everyone's trying to create a moment now. Everyone's a producer, so there's pressure to be more interesting. And if you're not interesting enough, what have you got wrong with you?" In the interview, the singer also volunteered, "I met my first friend who was a transsexual when I was 15. She used to really rib me. She used to pull her penis out. She was absolutely gross." According to Stonewall, more than 4 in 5 trans young people have experienced name-calling or abuse. 3 in 5 have experienced threats and intimidation, and more than a third have experienced physical assaults. Moreover, more than 1 in 4 trans young people have attempted to commit suicide, whereas 9 in 10 have thought about it. But if we listen to Boy George, they probably just think whatever's going on for them is much more important than anything else. Now, there's a couple of things to unpack with this story. But first of all, let's just quickly discuss some of the things that George said. Now, his tone wasn't really that insulting. He is talking about this kind of weird world we live in where the whole kind of trans movement in the way that we know it is something new. Yes, there have been transsexuals for decades, and there has been a push for trans rights since even in the early 20th century. But the whole idea of neo-pronouns, the multitudes of different genders out there, is more of a new phenomenon, or at least something that has only broken out into the mainstream over the last decade or so. So it is understandable that people who haven't really been used to that kind of thinking are going to struggle with the idea that there are trigender people, as an example of a gender which is considered a legitimate gender because, after all genders are valid. But he also talked about the fact that he would be willing to use people's preferred pronouns. That's something which I would do as well, because ultimately I don't want to upset people unless, of course, you've done absolutely nothing to earn those particular pronouns, like, say, this person. You can still have your opinions on whether or not it's really worthwhile to do so. I mean, surely this is a world which we live in where we can have fair conversations about the way in which we address one another, especially if you're using a word that's never been used to address someone individually before. Not just they, per se, but the kind of neo-pronouns like sie and schlim and all of those weird noises. They're still not really a part of natural language. And before anyone says, "Oh no, it's only people on Twitter who use it," no, I've come across people in real life who use pronouns like sie. It is a thing. But the real kind of takeaway from this story is the entire framing behind it. So let's really kind of break down bit by bit what the kind of attitude that Pink News has towards Boy George. So, first of all, they start off by saying trans people are being murdered every week. Now, having gone through the story, there is more to it than what I've talked about, but the murder rate is never actually mentioned about trans people. The closest they come is just saying more than a third have experienced physical assault. But that's just physical assault. There's nothing in their story that relates to the murder rate. But even if there was, what has that got to do with the kind of comments that Boy George made? Is it really the right thing to do when it's just someone talking about pronouns and the idea that people are probably using it more for attention, which again is a thought that a lot of us in the LGBT community believe in? Hell, I've even started speaking to a number of non-binary people who recognize that there are some people doing it for attention. So you can't just call this a mainstream LGBT view when all across the spectrum there are people disagreeing with it. But then you have recent stories like a paratrans woman in Panama who were recently killed. And then you kind of use that kind of rhetoric as a framing device for attacking Boy George. One of my biggest problems when the kind of activists talk about trans murder rates is it's always for political point scoring. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of compassion for people. And when you're throwing around statistics or just the idea that trans people are being murdered every week, which I've discussed at length in the past, is not quite at epidemic proportions, mind you. It sounds like you're very much trivializing what's going on. Trans people being murdered have absolutely nothing to do with what Boy George said. Nothing. There's no connection. And the fact that Pink News tried to make that connection is absolutely revolting. And then we have the combination of disgraced singer Boy George and convicted criminal George O'Dowd. Now, that is very much a framing device, kind of setting up in your head that, oh, he is a nasty man. Now, Boy George is a convicted criminal. In 2009, he was sentenced to around 15 months in jail. Maybe it is worth mentioning, but it's interesting that Pink News mention it here, when in the past it hasn't necessarily been the kind of issue that they've cared about. For example, in this story from 2016 where Boy George said, "Don't call me gender fluid, I'm old-fashioned," they only really mention the conviction later on in the story, when they mention that back in April he opened up about his sexuality, drug use, and how his stint in prison helped him reassess his life. In fact, the story that they link to in that piece, Boy George never wanted to be straight, says prison sentence was a gift, isn't quite as condemning as the story on trans people. Now, the story on his pronoun usage is the one where they get really angry about it, but not when he's actually talking about being in prison, not when it is most relevant to talk about his conviction. They're nowhere near as judgmental, and they have a track record of never bringing this up in other stories. Boy George supports boycott of Eminem's homophobic single, no mention of him being disgraced and a convicted criminal there. Or straight musicians have more influence when advocating for gay rights. Again, no mention of anything to do with him being a criminal. And then we have this story, which is actually quite interesting. So I had a look through a lot of Pink News' past, and basically the pattern of referring to him as a convicted criminal and a disgrace only really seems to come in when it's convenient for them to do point scoring, mostly around trans issues. But look at this story where he mentioned about Bruce Jenner being very brave before Bruce came out as Caitlyn Jenner. Now, they've taken the whole story down, and it hasn't been archived, unfortunately, so I can't actually see the tone of the story itself. But the headline seems to suggest that actually it was fairly positive from it. I mean, they wouldn't have framed it in that way if it wasn't. And of course, this isn't the first time in recent weeks where Pink News has framed a story about a problematic person as being an absolute bigot just for having a slight opinion on trans issues, and then they will use their past as much as they can to really smear them. Like Darren Grimes, for example, who I talked about a few weeks ago. Brexiteer, a gay man who should know better, thinks it's funny to invalidate gender identities, mentioning the controversy about him being fined £20,000 and then having his fine overturned, but the focus is very much on how he's a bad man. And then you have a Tory councillor who says that he doesn't have any criticism of LGBT people, but shared a transphobic Greta Thunberg meme. The meme in question is just, my generation will start a revolution. My ass. Your generation can't work 40 hours in a week, can't decide whether you're a boy, a girl, or other, or can't eat meat without crying. And hell, look at this story about Justin Amash, who is running to be the Libertarian candidate for the upcoming US election, where he says that he would protect trans Americans, but his voting record begs to differ. Where the only real dirt that they have on him is that he didn't support the idea of trans people serving in the military. A lot of it is just him openly supporting LGBT rights, and whilst he previously disagreed with some, he since changed his mind. He doesn't come across as quite the negative that they want him to, but it's just kind of common with Pink News, the way in which they try and smear those that they disagree with. And I still want to speak a little bit more on this story, which really comes down to them throwing the typical trans statistics. You know, this is the, of course, self-reported information that Stonewall give out, which is that 4 in 5 young trans people have experienced name-calling, 3 in 5 experienced threats and intimidation, and 1/3 have experienced physical assault. And they seem to be trying to tie that in with what Boy George was talking about. Again, like the murder rate, this has absolutely nothing to do with the whole situation at large. They just like to throw in all of these negative stuff about trans people, whether it's for abuse or murder rates or anything, and anyone who has any kind of criticism of the movement seems to be bombarded with it. And as a result, that really waters down the impact of bullying and what that has on people with gender dysphoria, or violence, or perceived violence, or anything, really. Quite frankly, the way in which they've worded their story is absolutely disgusting. I do have a lot to talk about when it comes to Pink News and indeed other parts of the so-called queer media, but that's for another time. Now, the next story that I want to talk about involves the Democrats, as apparently they are incredibly transphobic, according to Pink News again. 6 trans and non-binary Democrats wanted to represent their communities. They were disqualified because of their gender. In March, Nandani Barrett, Casey Bonham, Michael Donatz, Derek Gaskill, Paige Hanover, and Angela Lascara-Grenwald, I've probably mispronounced all of those names, all submitted petitions to run for seats on the governing body of the Brooklyn Democrat Party. They are all trans, non-binary, or gender non-conforming, and had all left the gender field blank when they applied to run in the upcoming June and December elections because there was only a male or female option. On April 22nd, the 6 learned that the Board of Elections had disqualified them from the race, not because we did not collect enough signatures, but because of our genders, they wrote in a column for the Brooklyn paper. All 6 said they were eliminated because the Democratic primary ballot currently requires candidates to specify their gender as male or female only. Each of us have the right to run to represent our communities, but removing these gender barriers is critical to fixing our local political system. For many, holding a seat on county committees is the first stepping stone before running for higher office. Now, it should clarify that this all happened following a lawsuit that they brought against the Brooklyn Democratic Party, because when they first filled out the forms, they left the male or female blank, and then the Democrats actually filled it in for them, presumably based on their appearance. So they were actually allowed to run. But it doesn't quite explain as to how this ultimately stopped them from running. If the Democrats were very much against non-binary people or gender non-conforming people from running, surely they wouldn't have filled it out for them in the first place. It seems to be that they are allowing them to do it, and there isn't quite the case that they are ultimately being discriminated against for being non-binary. It should also be noted that one of the people running is actually a trans man, so I don't know why he didn't just select man in that. Is that not the point of your transition? But there's probably a lot more to this. Now, if it was simply a case that the Democrats openly discriminated against people who were non-binary and said, you're not allowed to run if you are non-binary, or anything along those lines that actually stopped them, not a tick box on a form, but them being stopped specifically for being non-binary, first of all, I would have a very hard time believing that would happen with the Democrats of all people. They are very much into the progressive narrative right now, and if anything, they would want to have as many NBs running as possible so they can really virtue signal. But I don't believe that to be the case. I don't believe that the Democrats would actually do that. But let's say that they did, and they openly said, no, we don't want NB people running. I would probably agree with them that that would be discrimination, and I would say that MBs should be allowed to run for office if they wish. But all of this is more of a squabble as to how a form is filled out. It seems like they want to smear a whole party as being transphobic or MB-phobic simply for not catching up with the times enough. Not kind of realising that that is going to once again reflect on the rest of the community who will be hearing that the Democrats are this nasty NB-phobic party and then not want to get involved. Surely there's better ways of being able to change it rather than smearing everyone simply for not immediately falling in line. As to whether the Democrats really changed that form or not, I'll be honest, I don't personally care because it doesn't impact me. I'm never going to run for office in the Democrats at all, ever. And if they want to do that, then that's fine. But when it's being framed as it's specifically that they're not allowed to run for being non-binary, when that isn't actually what's going on, that in itself is quite worrying. Now, the last story that I want to talk about this week involves the Department of Health and Social Care and coronavirus, because that is, of course, the main story of the year. Now, they tweeted out yesterday, at the time of filming, there is emerging evidence to suggest that coronavirus may be having a disproportionate impact on some ethnic groups as well as certain genders. We're launching a review into the factors impacting health outcomes to address health inequalities. Look at the framing of that. Some ethnic groups, okay, that's something which we're aware of, that because there are different ethnic groups who are being affected more by the coronavirus than others, and that could well deserve being looked into. But certain genders, now that seems to be a weird narrative being pushed when, from all intents and purposes, it doesn't seem to really matter how you identify your gender, but more what your biological sex is. In fact, if you have a look at the government website on reviewing factors impacting health outcomes from COVID-19, they do seem to state that there is a bit of a difference between gender and sex. The review will help provide insight into emerging evidence to suggest COVID-19 may be having a disproportionate impact on different groups and examine the potential effects of other factors such as ethnicity, level of obesity, or gender. The review will also match laboratory records of COVID-19 cases to existing health records to draw down accurate data such as ethnicity and describe the association with COVID-19 cases alongside other factors such as sex, age, and geographical location. So they seem to be making a distinction between sex and gender. So why aren't they running with the narrative of what the biological fact is here about male and female, rather than the way in which you identify? That might be putting out a bit of a false notion to some people who could be dumb enough to think, well, I'm a trans woman, so it's not going to affect me more. What I found particularly interesting was a backbench Conservative peer, Ralph Lucas, actually tweeted a response to the Department of Health saying, I have put down a question for written answer to ask what evidence you have that gender affects the impact of coronavirus, how many genders you believe there to be, which the affected genders are, or whether instead of certain genders, you should have used the word males. Absolutely fantastic put down. In fact, I would really love to see the government actually lay down a whole list of recognised genders and what those genders are. This kind of goes a bit beyond just who would be impacted by coronavirus, because the government is really acknowledging the idea that there are loads of genders. So actually let us know what these genders are, and would they actually impact the way in which you're being affected by COVID-19, considering everything seems to point to biological males being the most affected. In fact, some MPs have even noticed that actually, no MPs are being affected at all. Like, none of them. Maybe they have the right idea here. We don't need a vaccine. We all just need to change our pronouns to they. But it is kind of worrying that we have a government organisation pushing a line like this at a time when it's not needed. It's perfectly fine to focus on it being sex-related at a time when it's very likely to be sex-related and not related to how you identify. But it's another example of how the kind of toxic rot of identity politics is infecting our government institutions. Thankfully, this was ratioed all the way. So I think a lot of people are waking up to how ridiculous this is. But it's troubling nonetheless that this was something they actually ran with. So what are your thoughts on the stories I've covered this week? Is there anything in particular I've missed out? Please let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching. Before you go, just to let you know, there's going to be a live stream on Thursday, so watch out for that. And I am working on a lot more content, and I'll have more to announce on that soon. I know I say that a lot, but I mean it. If you enjoy my work, please support me on Patreon and Subscribestar. I know this is a difficult time for a lot of people. It would really help me out. But obviously I understand if you have other priorities. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And thank you all once again. I'll see you all next time. And a special thanks to Alex Meadows, Alyssa Morris, Casey Adolphson, Dan Norman, Fenella Cooney, Leslie Lever, Holly Mahone, James C. George, Janine Karen, Jess, Joe, Kim Vandry, Latin Creature, Lauren Manleaf, Moy Felicita, Ricardo Jose, Steve Hendricks, Tennessee Barfly, The Poor of Rizzo, Traname Girl, Zoe, Illiterati, Stefan Hansen, Laisha, James UK, and the rest of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar.